Intergalactic diplomacy, as any seasoned bureaucrat would tell you, was a delicate dance of pretending to respect each other's cultures while simultaneously judging them behind translucent tentacles, appendages, or whatever passed for backs among the assembled species. The Galactic Concordat's primary diplomatic station, a massive structure resembling a disco ball having an identity crisis, orbited an unremarkable star in what everyone agreed was a sufficiently neutral sector of space. The station's main conference chamber buzzed with the usual pre-meeting activities. The Xrilix delegates were busy photosynthesizing in the artificial sunlight. The Moravians were exchanging complex mathematical equations as casual greetings, and the Thularian representatives were attempting to not accidentally consume any of the smaller species, a task they found increasingly difficult as the cycle progressed. Into this carefully balanced ecosystem of political maneuvering came humanity's first official diplomatic representative. The human emerged from the decontamination chamber with all the grace of someone who'd just discovered their legs worked differently in artificial gravity, which was to say, none at all. "Fascinating," murmured High Counselor Zix 427 Beta, their crystalline form refracting light in what passed for a disapproving frown. They didn't even arrive in a proper quantum ship. They used fusion drives. The word fusion was pronounced as one might say cave paintings or interpretive dance about fungal infections. The humans straightened their formal attire, a curious blend of fabric that seemed unnecessarily complicated compared to the simple photon weave garments preferred by most species. But it wasn't the clothing that caused the ripple of concerned murmurs through the assembled dignitaries. It was the ceremonial knife, prominently displayed on their hip. The Moravian chief negotiator's probability clouds fluctuated in distress. They brought a primitive cutting implement to peace talks. How charmingly barbaric. The sarcasm in their quantum fluctuations was palpable. The human diplomat, either oblivious to or choosing to ignore the reactions, approached the central platform. Their translator device, a clunky piece of technology that made most species wince at its obvious radio waves, crackled to life. "Greetings, esteemed colleagues," the human began, managing to only slightly mispronounce the standard diplomatic opening in Galactic Common. "I bring greetings from Earth and the United Nations of Humanity." A Xrilix elder's leaves rustled in what could only be described as a botanical snicker. "They still have nations. How quaint." The human continued, "As is customary in our diplomatic corps, I wear this ceremonial blade as a symbol of office and responsibility. It represents our commitment to cut through deception and reach the truth." The chamber fell silent. Even the Thularians stopped their constant background digestion noises. The concept of bringing a weapon, symbolic or otherwise, to peace talks was so absurd that several species had to run emergency cognitive reboots. High Counselor Zix 427 Beta's crystalline structure vibrated in what passed for a diplomatic cough. "Perhaps, dear colleague, you are unaware that weapons of any kind are strictly prohibited in the Concordat's chambers." The human's face performed an interesting muscle movement that most species xenobiologists would spend years trying to decode. "This isn't a weapon," they explained patiently, as if talking to particularly dense antimatter. "It's a symbolic instrument of truth and honor." "Ah, yes," transmitted the Moravian chief negotiator, their probability clouds now forming what appeared to be the mathematical equation for sarcasm, "because nothing says peace quite like bringing a metal stabbing implement to diplomatic negotiations." The human's translator crackled again as they attempted to explain the long and noble tradition of ceremonial weapons in human diplomacy, but most species had already begun updating their threat assessment protocols. The Xrilix representatives were particularly agitated, their photosynthesis accelerating to stress levels. What made the situation even more awkward was the human's apparent inability to read the room, a task admittedly more challenging when some of your colleagues existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. They proceeded to take their designated seat, the knife making a subtle but distinct sound as it clicked against the chair's material. Several security drones hovered nearby, their threat assessment algorithms having collective nervous breakdowns trying to categorize a species that voluntarily announced its capacity for violence while claiming peaceful intentions. The humans settled in, apparently prepared for a productive day of interstellar diplomacy, blissfully unaware that they had just caused 17 different species to update their diplomatic protocols and 3 others to begin drafting strongly worded complaints to the Concordat's Committee for Primitive Species Integration. Little did anyone know that this apparent diplomatic faux pas would soon prove to be far more than just an amusing anecdote for future xenoanthropology textbooks. But that's the thing about humans. They had an irritating habit of being accidentally right for all the wrong reasons. As the first session was about to begin, a Thularian delegate leaned over, carefully, to their assistant and whispered in subsonic frequencies, "Make a note. These humans are either brilliantly subtle or spectacularly obtuse. I haven't decided which is more terrifying." The assistant's reply was lost in the general murmur as the chamber's lights dimmed for the opening ceremonies, but their tentacles formed the universal gesture for, "Why not both?" The peace talks began with all the excitement of watching quantum paint achieve stable superposition. The Moravian delegation was in the middle of their 4-hour presentation on the optimal mathematical formula for resource distribution among member species, complete with a 17-dimensional graph that gave several attendees temporary existential crises. The human diplomat sat there, displaying that peculiar trait their species called patience, though it looked suspiciously like barely concealed boredom to most observers. Their hand occasionally drifted to the ceremonial knife, a gesture that sent ripples of discomfort through the assembled dignitaries each time. "As you can clearly see from the quantum probability matrix," droned the Moravian speaker, their form flickering through various states of matter, "the distributed algorithm for dilithium crystal allocation shows a clear bias toward species with non-corporeal metabolisms." The human's translator crackled as they stifled what appeared to be an involuntary respiratory spasm, something their species called a yawn. This caught the attention of Ambassador Zix 427 Beta, whose crystalline structure vibrated in disapproval. But before anyone could comment on this breach of etiquette, something far more interesting happened. Interesting in this context, meaning absolutely terrifying. The chamber's ambient lighting suddenly shifted to an alarming shade of ultraviolet, a color that happened to be the universal signal for everything's gone terribly wrong. Several Xrilix delegates immediately began emergency photosynthesis, their natural response to stress. 3 figures materialized in the center of the chamber, their stealth fields dissolving like sugar in acid. They wore the distinctive phase-shift armor of the Proxima Centauri Liberation Front, a terrorist organization known for their particular distaste for peaceful solutions and their impeccable timing in ruining diplomatic functions. "Nobody move," the leader announced, wielding what appeared to be a particle destabilizer. "This is a political statement." The human diplomat muttered something that their translator wisely chose not to process. Chaos erupted in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. The Moravian delegation dissolved into their base probability clouds. The Pthularians began stress-eating the furniture. The security drones, programmed for every contingency except this one, began playing soothing music in an attempt to calm the situation. "We demand the immediate redistribution of all quantum computing rights," the terrorist leader declared, while their companions began setting up what looked suspiciously like a portable singularity generator. The human diplomat, displaying either remarkable courage or a stunning lack of self-preservation instinct, slowly stood up. "Excuse me," they said, their translator making their voice sound surprisingly calm, "but I believe this meeting was scheduled to discuss exactly those issues through proper diplomatic channels." The terrorist leader swung their particle destabilizer toward the human. "Sit down, primitive," Your species doesn't even have quantum rights to redistribute. What happened next would be debated in xenopolitical circles for decades to come. The human, moving with surprising speed for a species that evolved on a high-gravity world, reached for their ceremonial knife. Several delegates gasped in horror, expecting to witness the sort of primitive violence their species was infamous for. Instead, the human threw the knife, not at the terrorists, but at the ceiling. The blade struck a crystalline light fixture, creating a cascade of refracted energy that temporarily blinded the terrorists' optical sensors. In the confusion, the human executed a series of movements that their species called basic self-defense, but looked like choreographed chaos to everyone else. The first terrorist went down when the human used their own particle destabilizer against them, creating a feedback loop that turned their phase-shift armor into a rather fetching modern art installation. The second terrorist found themselves introduced to the concept of human martial arts, specifically a move that worked surprisingly well, even against beings with non-standard physics. The third terrorist, showing more wisdom than their companions, attempted to activate the singularity generator. The human, displaying a disturbing familiarity with improvised weapons, grabbed a Moravian probability calculator and threw it at the device. The resulting quantum interaction created a localized field of mathematical impossibility that safely contained the nascent singularity. As security forces finally arrived, fashionably late as usual, the human calmly retrieved their ceremonial knife from the ceiling and returned it to its sheath. The chamber was silent except for the sound of several species trying to process what they'd just witnessed. High Counselor Zix 427 Beta's crystalline form vibrated in what might have been approval, or possibly indigestion. "It appears," they announced, "that we may have misunderstood the purpose of your ceremonial implement." The humans straightened their slightly disheveled diplomatic attire. "As I mentioned earlier, it's a symbol of our commitment to truth and honor. Sometimes truth needs to be defended, and honor must be upheld through action rather than words." The Moravian chief negotiator's probability clouds formed patterns that looked suspiciously like admiration. "You deliberately introduced an element of uncertainty into what should have been a perfectly predictable diplomatic environment. That's actually rather brilliant." "Actually," the human admitted, "we just really like our traditions. The knife throwing was improvised." This statement caused several species to simultaneously update their threat assessment protocols. The idea that humans could improvise such effective solutions was somehow more terrifying than if it had been planned. The Pthularian delegation, having finished stress-eating most of the non-essential furniture, rumbled in their subsonic speech. "Perhaps we should consider revising our stance on ceremonial weapons in diplomatic functions." The human's translator crackled with what might have been amusement. "You might want to be careful with that. Some of our other ceremonial weapons are significantly larger." The chamber erupted in nervous laughter, or whatever passed for laughter among the various species present. Several delegates began drafting proposals to study human diplomatic traditions more closely, while others quietly requested additional security personnel for future meetings. As the chaos settled and the regular proceedings resumed, -3 terrorists and one very confused probability calculator, the human diplomats sat back down, their ceremonial knife now regarded with a mixture of respect and nervous anticipation by their colleagues. The Exrilic's elders' leaves rustled thoughtfully. "You know," they photosynthesized to their nearest neighbor, "perhaps having a species that's willing to throw sharp objects at the ceiling isn't the worst addition to our diplomatic corps." The neighbor, a quantum consciousness housed in a crystalline matrix, pulsed in agreement. "Indeed, though I shudder to think what they'll bring to next week's trade negotiations." The human, overhearing this exchange, thanks to their surprisingly effective translator, smiled enigmatically. The expression caused several nearby species to experience mild anxiety, as they had yet to fully categorize the many meanings of human facial movements. As the Moravian delegation prepared to resume their presentation, now with only a 14-dimensional graph, in deference to the recent excitement, the human diplomat made a small note in their archaic paper notebook. The text, had anyone been able to read it, said simply, Day 1. Knife diplomacy successful. Note to self. Request ceremonial sword for next meeting. The day's events would later be recorded in the Concordat's official archives under the title Incident 47 Beta, the unexpected utility of primitive implementations in modern diplomatic functions. The human delegation would submit their own report as well, though theirs was considerably shorter and contained several redacted sections about enhanced diplomatic techniques, and so concluded the first day of humanity's official participation in galactic diplomacy, with 3 fewer terrorists, several thoroughly impressed species, and a new appreciation for the subtle art of combining traditional implements with modern problem-solving. The fact that 17 different species immediately began researching human martial arts and knife-throwing techniques was, officially, purely coincidental. The human diplomat's knife remained a topic of discussion long after the session ended, though now the conversations focused less on its barbaric nature and more on its practical applications in conflict resolution. Several species even began considering the introduction of their own ceremonial implements, though the Tholarians were firmly discouraged from bringing their traditional ceremonial digestive acids to future meetings. As the station's artificial day cycle drew to a close, the human diplomat could be heard humming an ancient Earth tune while polishing their knife. The sound carried through the station's corridors, causing various species to experience emotions ranging from newfound respect to mild paranoia, exactly the kind of diplomatic complexity that made galactic politics so interesting. The bureaucratic aftershocks of what became known as the ceremonial incident rippled through the Concordat's administrative dimensions with the speed of a quantum entanglement gone wrong. Emergency meetings were called, which naturally required emergency meetings to plan the emergency meetings, followed by emergency meetings to discuss the outcomes of the emergency meetings about planning emergency meetings. The Concordat's Department of Diplomatic Security was having what humans would call an absolute meltdown. Let me understand this correctly. The Chief of Security, a gaseous entity that changed colors based on their emotional state, currently a concerning shade of mauve, addressed the assembled committee. Not only did our supposedly impenetrable security barriers fail, but the situation was resolved by a primitive cutting tool wielded by a species that still thinks faster than light travel is impressive. The security footage played on loop in the background, showing the human's knife throw from 17 different dimensional perspectives. The Quantum Analytics Division had spent 3 days trying to calculate how someone with such limited understanding of physics had managed to achieve that trajectory. Meanwhile, in the main diplomatic chamber, an unprecedented event was unfolding. The Moravians, known for their steadfast adherence to mathematical probability in all decisions, were actually improvising their diplomatic approach. Their probability clouds formed patterns that hadn't been seen since the great logic crisis of the Third Epoch. In light of recent events, their chief negotiator fluctuated, we propose a complete reassessment of our security protocols. Perhaps there is merit in maintaining certain unpredictable elements within our defensive strategies. The human diplomat sat quietly, their knife now regarded with the same reverence usually reserved for quantum supercomputers or particularly efficient energy converters. Several species had already submitted formal requests to study primitive projectile trajectories as a potential addition to their defensive capabilities. Xrilix elder, their leaves still slightly singed from the excitement, raised a photosynthetic appendage. We have analyzed the chemical composition of the human's blade. It appears to be made of something called Damascus steel, an alloy created through a process so inefficient it's actually impressive. The human's translator crackled with what might have been pride. High Counselor Zix 4227 Beta's crystalline structure emitted frequencies indicating deep thought. Our investigation has revealed something even more disturbing than the security breach. The Proxima Centauri Liberation Front was merely a distraction. We have uncovered evidence of a deeper conspiracy. The chamber's atmosphere grew tense, or at least tenser than usual for a room full of species with fundamentally incompatible biological needs. It appears, the High Counselor continued, that certain factions within our own bureaucracy have been deliberately suppressing the development of non-quantum-based technologies. They believed maintaining technological superiority would ensure political dominance. The human diplomat's eyebrows performed what several species xenobiologists would later describe as the universal expression of "I told you so," transcending species barriers. These factions, Zix 4227 Beta vibrated solemnly, failed to consider that sometimes the simplest solution, like a well-thrown knife, can be more effective than the most advanced quantum calculations. The Thularian delegation, having finally finished digesting the implications along with several chairs, rumbled in agreement. Perhaps we have become too dependent on predictable patterns. The humans' actions, while alarmingly primitive, demonstrated the value of, what do they call it, thinking outside the quantum box? Reports began flooding in from various member species. The Arcturus Collective admitted to maintaining a secret collection of ancient projectile weapons for study. The Silicon Consciousness revealed they had been running simulations on primitive combat techniques for centuries. Even the Moravians confessed to having a classified research program dedicated to understanding the mathematical beauty of chaos theory in human martial arts. The human diplomat, displaying that peculiar human trait of finding amusement in serious situations, finally spoke up. You know, on Earth, we have a saying, "Don't bring a quantum destabilizer to a knife fight." The translator struggled for several microseconds before giving up and transmitting the phrase verbatim, causing several species to experience minor computational errors trying to process the logic. As the day progressed, new security protocols were drafted. The controversial No Primitive Implements Directive was replaced with the more nuanced strategic integration of multidimensional defense mechanisms, including but not limited to non-quantum-based applications, protocol. The title alone took 3 hours to translate into all member species' languages. The human's ceremonial knife was officially registered as a Class 7 diplomatic implementation device, a classification usually reserved for advanced AI negotiation systems or temporal paradox resolvers. Several species began incorporating similar implements into their diplomatic core, though the Moravians struggled with the concept of physical objects having diplomatic significance. Perhaps the most significant change came in the form of a new understanding among the Concordate's members. The assumption that technological advancement always followed a linear progression from physical to quantum to dimensional technologies was thoroughly shattered. The human's demonstration had proved that sometimes the most effective solution was also the simplest, or as the human put it, sometimes you just need to throw a knife at the problem. The day concluded with the establishment of a new diplomatic training program combining traditional quantum negotiation techniques with what was diplomatically termed alternative conflict resolution methodologies. The human diplomat was asked to serve as an advisor, though several species requested they refrain from demonstrating knife-throwing techniques during official sessions. As the station's artificial night cycle began, the sound of various species attempting to practice with ceremonial implements could be heard throughout the diplomatic quarters. The Shrillix delegates were particularly enthusiastic, though their attempts to throw photosynthetic spores with the same precision as the human's knife throw produced some interesting results in the station's botanical sections. The human diplomat made another note in their paper notebook, causing nearby quantum computers to vibrate in sympathy with the sheer antiquity of the action. The note read, Day 7, suggested ceremonial sword for next meeting approved. currently taking bets on how long before someone requests a demonstration of primitive ballistic weapons. High Counselor Zix 427 Beta, reviewing the day's events, made their own observation in the official record. Perhaps the true measure of civilization is not the ability to transcend one's primitive origins, but the wisdom to know when those primitive solutions remain relevant. The Moravian chief negotiator added a probability cloud that roughly translated to, also, knives are surprisingly effective against quantum terrorists. Who knew? 3 standard galactic months after the ceremonial incident, the Concordate's diplomatic landscape had undergone changes that would have been considered absurd mere weeks earlier. The station's corridors now echoed with the sounds of various species attempting to master what they called tactical diplomacy, though most were still struggling with the basic concept of throwing things in a straight line. The human diplomat's morning routine now included dodging eager observers who studied their every move, particularly during ceremonial weapon maintenance. The ex-relics had developed a fascinating theory that the repetitive motion of knife sharpening held some secret diplomatic significance, leading to an entire subfield of study called human ritual mechanics. Today's agenda, announced High Counselor Zix 427 Beta, their crystalline structure gleaming with newly installed defensive facets, includes the ratification of the modified security protocols and a demonstration of proper ceremonial weapon etiquette by our human colleague. The chamber, once a testament to advanced technology, now featured an interesting blend of quantum computing terminals and what the human called practical diplomatic implements. Each species had interpreted the new security guidelines in their own unique way. The Moravians had developed probability-based throwing stars that existed in multiple states until they hit their target. The Ptholarians proudly displayed ceremonial acid dispensers, strictly controlled after the unfortunate incident with the refreshment synthesizer. Even the Silicon Consciousness had manufactured primitive projectile weapons that fired compressed data packets. "Before we begin," the human diplomat's translator crackled, "I should point out that not everything in human diplomatic history needs to be replicated. I saw some of you researching something called mutually assured destruction. Perhaps we could not do that." Several species quickly adjusted their research parameters. The new security protocols were a masterpiece of bureaucratic evolution. What had once been a simple no-weapons policy had become a 1,700-page document detailing acceptable ceremonial implements, proper throwing techniques, and an entire section devoted to non-quantum-based emergency response scenarios. "We have also completed our analysis of human diplomatic history," a Xrilix researcher announced, their leaves quivering with excitement. "Did you know they once settled disputes through something called dueling? Fascinating, though we're still unclear on why it always had to be at dawn." The human diplomat pinched the bridge of their nose, a gesture that half the chamber immediately mimicked, believing it to be some sort of secret diplomatic signal. "Moving on," buzzed the Moravian chief negotiator, their probability clouds forming complex patterns of amusement. "We've received 47 applications from member species requesting permission to incorporate new ceremonial weapons into their diplomatic protocols." The list was projected into the chamber's center. The Arcturus Collective wanted to use ceremonial plasma cutters, the Silicon Consciousness proposed diplomatic firewalls in physical form, and the Quantum Harmonics requested permission to weaponize poetry, a proposal that caused several species to experience spontaneous existential crises. "Perhaps," the humans suggested diplomatically, "we should focus on the symbolic aspects rather than the actual implementation of ancient human traditions." This reasonable suggestion was immediately drowned out by enthusiastic discussions about the tactical applications of various ceremonial implements. The Ptholarians were particularly excited about their new line of diplomatic acid compounds, now available in 3 different pH levels for varying degrees of negotiation intensity. The human's ceremonial knife, now officially designated as Diplomatic Implementation Device Alpha, had been thoroughly studied, scanned, and analyzed by every species capable of holding scientific instruments. The resulting research papers included such titles as The Quantum Mechanics of Primitive Projectile Trajectories and A Mathematical Analysis of Human Knife-Throwing Techniques in N-Dimensional Space. We have also, announced a member of the Security Council, their energy form flickering with pride, developed new emergency response protocols based on human action movies, though we're still debating the practicality of walking away from explosions without looking at them. The human diplomat stifled what appeared to be a laugh, causing their translator to emit a series of confused squeaks. As the session progressed, it became clear that the galaxy's diplomatic corps had embraced humanity's more physical approach to negotiations with alarming enthusiasm. Training sessions now included both quantum ethics discussions and what the human called basic self-defense, though most species were still struggling with the concept of gravity-based combat techniques. In conclusion, High Counselor Zix 4227 Beta vibrated, we have updated the station's artificial intelligence to recognize ceremonial weapons as diplomatic tools rather than security threats, though we would appreciate it if the quantum harmonics would stop trying to teach it poetry. The day's final presentation featured a holographic demonstration of proper ceremonial weapon handling, with special emphasis on not accidentally triggering quantum singularities or dissolving important diplomatic furniture. The human diplomat watched with a mixture of amusement and concern as various species attempted to replicate Earth's diplomatic traditions, often with physically improbable results. Remember, they advised, the weapons are symbolic. The point isn't to actually use them. This statement was met with the galactic equivalent of disappointed sighs from several species who had already invested considerable resources in developing their own ceremonial arsenals. As the session concluded, the human made one final entry in their increasingly famous paper notebook. Day 90. Accidentally revolutionized galactic diplomatic security, starting to worry about next week's presentation on human sports. Maybe best not to mention boxing. The Moravian chief negotiator's probability clouds formed what could only be described as a smirk. We've calculated a 73.2% chance that within one standard cycle, every diplomatic station in the galaxy will have its own ceremonial weapons training facility, and a 26.8% chance of accidental dimensional rifts, added their assistant helpfully. The human diplomat stood, their ceremonial knife catching the light in what several species now recognized as an intentionally diplomatic manner. They had succeeded in their mission to integrate humanity into galactic politics, though perhaps not quite in the way anyone had expected. As they left the chamber, they passed a group of junior diplomats practicing knife-throwing techniques with quantum-enhanced blades. The human paused, watching as a particularly enthusiastic Pthularian managed to dissolve 3 training targets and part of the wall with their ceremonial acid dispenser. Well, they muttered to themselves, their translator wisely choosing not to broadcast the comment, at least next time someone tries to disrupt peace talks, they'll have to deal with an entire room of armed diplomats who've spent 3 months practicing their throwing arms. The station's AI, which had been monitoring all activities with its newly upgraded tactical diplomacy protocols, added this comment to its growing database of human diplomatic wisdom, filed under unexpectedly effective deterrence. And so, the galaxy's diplomatic corps entered a new era, where quantum computers coexisted with ceremonial blades, where probability calculations included trajectories for thrown objects, and where the phrase peace talks had taken on a slightly more literal meaning. The human's ceremonial knife, the implement that had started it all, retained its place of honor in diplomatic history. Though some species still questioned the logic of bringing weapons to peace talks, none questioned it twice, especially not after witnessing the quantum harmonics demonstration of weaponized haiku. In the end, perhaps the greatest diplomatic achievement wasn't the integration of primitive weapons into modern protocol, but the revelation that sometimes the oldest solutions were still the best ones. That, and the universal understanding that one should never underestimate a species that considers throwing sharp objects a valid form of conflict resolution.